And to really understand new directions, we have to see emerging scholars. So we're really super excited to have three great emerging scholars who will talk with us about their research and some of their experiences in graduate education and the academy more broadly, so that we can all share essentially in these kind of big questions that I think are so central to our nation. So I'm going to ask our panelists. I'm just going to give you a super brief introduction, but what I would like ideally is we'll just kind of go one by one and have you maybe introduce yourself a little bit more and just give a little bit of background about who you are and maybe what kind of research you're doing, what kind of projects you're working on. So we'll start with Mr. Ivy. Andre Ivy is a graduate student in sociology at Florida State University. And of course, he is a GSW graduate. So we're excited to have him back in this way, but also really looking forward to hearing more about what he's doing now. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, as mentioned, I am a GSW graduate and I'm studying sociology right now. I graduated from GSW in 2014 with the undergrad in sociology. And essentially after that, I went to Valdosta State University, where I also studied sociology and got a master's in sociology. And I'm currently still technically a student at Valdosta State because I am working on getting a degree in criminal justice, a master's in criminal justice. And right now, where I am is in Tallahassee, settled, trying to get my focus on my sociology degree right now and get a PhD in sociology. And my focus in terms of my area of interest is microsociology. So basically, leaning towards social interactionism and the sociology of morality. I'm also interested, of course, in like issues related to the criminal justice system. My recent work includes a paper on aggrieved whiteness. So we basically interviewed Trump supporters and we got a feel for like how they were constructing themselves as aggrieved white people and essentially understanding this sort of political movement surrounding Trumpism from a more microsociological perspective. I also am currently working on my master's paper, which focuses on how ex-offenders, or particularly formerly, the best term to use is formerly incarcerated individuals, how they construct themselves, how they construct moral identities, and how they manage stigma. Not just stigma from employers, but also stigma when they're like entering the community. So that's what I'm interested in right now. And that's what I'm working on for my dissertation. For my master's paper in particular, I actually interviewed service workers, individuals who work with ex-offenders. And essentially there, I was also looking at how they construct moral identities in order to better connect with the ex-offenders that they serve. And I feel like that's pretty much it in terms of, the work that I've been doing. Yeah, that's it.
So a lot of stuff, and that's just kind of it, right? That sounds like a lot of very rich, complex research. So I will look forward to coming back, and I hope bringing in some questions from students more about the specifics of both of those projects. Maybe we can move to Maya. You're our historian, right? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you're doing and what kind of interests are driving you.
Sure, of course. So hi, everyone. My name is Maya Brooks. I went to Agnes Scott College for undergrad, where I got my BA in history in 2018. And then I went to the University of West Georgia and got my master's degree in public history, as well as a post-bac certificate in museum studies. And now I am a first-year PhD student at the University of Georgia. And my area of historical research is really 20th century United States African-American history and Georgia history. So my master's thesis actually looked at the 1996 Centennial Olympic Games and kind of studied the motivations for hosting an Olympic Games and who is ultimately impacted by such large scale events. Other areas of research I've looked in are fair housing history in the United States in the 20th century. And for my dissertation, I hope to continue with Georgia history and focus on the legacy of Atlanta's Black mayors. That's the plan right now, but I'm a first year PhD student, so it's likely to change. So that's everything that I have right now.
Great, great. Yeah, I remember those experiences of the first year when you have about 10 topics often that you want to study, right? But those all sound very, very interesting. And I look forward again to coming back with some questions, particularly about public history as well. That might be something to share a little bit more with our students. Sakani, you want to provide an introduction for yourself and your research?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm happy to be here. So I went to undergrad at Cal Poly Pomona in California, Los Angeles County. And then I got my master's at UC Santa Barbara, where I am still there, actually getting out this year, getting my PhD in sociology as well. Thank you. It's been a journey, so I'm excited. So I actually, things that I studied, so in undergrad, which I can talk more about, but I was a McNair scholar. So during that time, I did study cheerleading, race and cheerleading, so racial identity in cheerleading, which was fun. I can talk more about that if anyone's interested in just the process of McNair. And then when I went to, I did like a master's and PhD program, so it's combined. So throughout that program, I have been studying the experiences of Black women in ballet. So overarching, I'm looking at race and culture, specifically elite culture, which is something I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in looking at the experiences, like how Black people navigate elite cultural spaces, which is something we also don't always talk about. And so that's something I've been looking at through Black women in ballet. I also consider Black men, which leads to another interest of mine. I love looking at masculinity and how it's racialized and just how men navigate masculinity within those spaces. But overall, I am looking at the experiences of Black women. And so when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at how they navigate this space that they know isn't designed for them and historically has been known as a white elite space. And so I'm looking at little things like kind of microaggressions that not little things, but, looking at microaggressions, symbolic interactions, the little things kind of like tights and point shoes and hairstyles and how that affects their experience within the space. And then just overarching just discrimination and racism that takes place in the space as well. And so that's those are the main things I'm doing. Again, I'm really interested in looking at privilege and elite culture. So I'm planning on expanding on that as the time goes, and also looking at sports and embodiment.
Mm-hmm. Well, that all sounds super interesting. And again, I hope we have lots of good questions to open up some of the work that you're doing. I'm going to pass the question baton over to my colleague, Dr. Ghosh. But one thing I just want to note also is that it's interesting that you all come from essentially various stages across the process of graduate education. And so I look forward to hearing more about that as well. Dr. Ghosh?
Yeah, hi. So secondly, since I already read your piece that talks about the challenges of Black female ballet dancers in this white elite space. So what kind of challenges, like if you could talk more about them, like more in detail so that, students have an idea and all of us have an idea about what kind of challenges you were specifically talking about. And if you could just shed light on, let's say, the intersectional analysis, especially for Black men ballet dancers, like how are they similar or different in comparison to Black female dancers?
Yes. So some of the challenges that Black women face is going back to controlling images, which Patricia Hill Collins coined, and we can talk more about. But essentially, it's like these labels that are already perpetuated on these on specifically Black women. That's what she discussed. So that's kind of what I like focus on, the tropes of Black women, but also Black men, which I'll get into. And so one of those things is, again, just even starting and navigating into this space. Ballet is so demanding and so exclusive. So in general, it's hard for almost anyone to get in. It's kind of like professional sports. They take about like the 1%. But for Black women, again, they're in this space that isn't designed for them. So things that they deal with are when it comes to getting roles. So certain roles, they're always kind of marginalized into roles that reiterate those controlling images and those tropes. So either like a big one that typically happens in ballet is like the Jezebel. So maybe today kind of like the video girl, anything that's kind of sexualized. That's typically the roles that Black women get, and also the mammies. So those are kind of the two that they typically get. So kind of being the maid, or like, you know, one of those, like the kind of like the mom. They don't always get the mom figure specifically, but something around that that kind of gives that image. So those are typically the roles that they get. But then outside of that, they're also just being in the space. So their everyday kind of rehearsals in life, they're also dealing with trying to manage their identity in these controlling images. So a lot of times, a lot of the women that I interviewed, they'll talk about, well, they dealt with some kind of form of racism or something. And anytime it's like, okay, so did you speak up or what happened? A lot of times they felt like, well, we don't have this voice, or I have to be careful because I don't want to get labeled as the angry Black woman, or as Patricia Collins coins it, like the sapphire. So those are like these kind of battles that they're constantly dealt with. So through performing and behind the scenes. And so in my article that I talk about this additional labor that these Black women have to endure. So everyone has this demand for their body. They have to look a certain way. It's hard for Black women because they're dealing with the trope and like the stigma that Black women don't have the ballet body, despite all Black women don't have the same body. So they don't even, you know, it's one of those things, you're homogenizing these Black women. They're also homogenized in the sense that we don't see so many Black women because they can't afford it. And that's not always true. I mean, the women that I interviewed, they're talking about, well, you know, like my parents were well off. So this conversation of like the Black middle class doesn't always happen. And that's something I'm exploring. And then just, again, like things that I mentioned, like little things. So when it comes to like point shoes and ballet and tights that they have to wear, typically when we think of ballet, we think of this ballet pink, right? And we don't always think of how it's not inclusive, or it doesn't complement darker skin tones. And since the point of ballet is to show off these lines that we have through our body, when you put darker skin women in these tights, it cuts off the line. So it doesn't look as flowy. It looks, a lot of times, a lot of the women share, they felt like they look, it made their legs look bigger or stumpier, which again is not part of the ballet look. So it's kind of going back and forth, and it's not in their best interest. So these are little things. And so for them, they have to do this additional labor of dyeing their tights when they're allowed to in spaces that they can, or painting their point shoes, which, you know, sometimes it doesn't seem like a big idea, but again, it's the cost of money to buy the extra makeup. And I don't know how many of you have looked at the price of makeup. It's not cheap. So to constantly have to do that. And then it's just, you're walking in this space and you're trying to, like, you can't last minute, like, oh, I need to go grab point shoes, because you walk in the store and you don't see any that will complement you. You have to still do this added labor. Which again, all ballet dancers have to break in their point shoes, but the fact that you have to put this makeup on top of it, and then you have to do it in time to make sure it dries. So there's no room for this error, like this last minute. And that kind of goes back to this whole thing, like where Black people are constantly told they have to be 2 times better. Like you always have to be more prepared. They don't have that agency of doing things last minute. And then when it comes to men were interesting. So I also talk about, again, the controlling images that are attached to men, which typically Black women and men typically have these similar tropes, which is like being considered masculine or hypersexualized and things like that. But it worked to the favor of these Black men. For them, because they were seen as hyper masculine, it looked like, one of my participants talked about how he was paired with this white woman and it made her look more feminine being next to him. And in his mind, and a lot of the men that I interviewed, in their idea, it sounded great, right? Because it's like, well, I get this opportunity, like it gives them this agency, this space to move up on this glass ceiling, essentially. But the the tropes that they're utilizing for their advantage have historically been very detrimental to Black men throughout history. So it kind of goes back. I don't know how many of you have seen, like, you know, the image of like King Kong holding the woman and how that was depicted to be like a Black man. And then we saw it on the cover of Vogue with LeBron James and Giselle, right? So we're seeing how this perpetuates, and it has such a violent history. But in ballet, in their, you know, through them sharing their stories, this is their way of getting opportunities. Now, of course, they still experience racism, but they also talk about how they have this advantage where Black women are disadvantaged for the same tropes.
Mhm. I would imagine that some of these themes are part of a dialogue that Andre might also talk to about, essentially the kind of homogenizing kind of effort to sort of categorize people and to define ex-offenders in particular ways by race and gender. And maybe that's something that you could just speak a little bit more about. We did have a question from James F. Brooks about noting that great topic, Andre, would like to hear more results. And I know you had a couple different projects there, but I'm gonna guess it might be speaking to some of the issues that you study on the criminal justice side.
It definitely does. And not even just on the criminal justice side, but even just like in terms of looking at identity work, which is like the perspective in which I examine a lot of these issues, and looking at embodiment and how individuals engage in body work in order to manage the stigma that they are experiencing. Something that I'm interested in looking at particularly is how ex-offenders, when they're out in the world looking for employment, how do they sort of, what sort of body work do they engage in, or what sort of like, you know, what work do they engage in order to sort of manage that stigma of, you know, the stigma that they have, and how does that management and how does that body work vary across racial lines is something that I'm interested in looking at too, mainly because I know understanding that, you know, African-American men particularly are, you know, they have a higher rate of recidivism than, you know, their white counterparts. So understanding what happens like on a micro level in order to kind of contribute to these disparities is what I'm interested in.
Interesting. Maya, since you and I are the historians in this group, we speak a little bit of a different language, but there's a lot of course, connections between past and present that I can identify here. If you are interested in kind of political history, it sounds like, of African Americans in Georgia, are there ways that you sought to recognize the vitality and the diversity of African American political thought in our state?
Yeah, definitely. I think I recognize that like Atlanta in itself, like the last 7 mayors have been Black, and you can't say that for any other like major American city. And I feel like not enough people have talked about that and the reasons behind it. But it goes back even further in the historical narrative than that. Like Atlanta politics are kind of a special case where there's always kind of been governed by coalition politics, which the white business community and the white politicians recognized that they couldn't get elected without the Black vote. So they sought out different leaders from that side of the city, and they kind of governed the city by coalition politics going back into like the early 20th century. Even before there were Black mayors, they always had some sort of representative from who kind of represented all of Black Atlantans, which is where the complicated dynamics come in, because these representatives that they chose were often from like the elite Black community, and they're obviously not representative of all the experiences of Black Atlantans, especially the poor and working class Blacks. So a lot of my work kind of looks at the dynamic between poor and working class Blacks and this Black elite, and how the poor and working class Blacks often are the ones kind of hurt in these scenarios, because The Black elites are doing what they can to appease the white business community in this coalition politics that we participate in. And so in the case of the Olympics, that was a huge factor, whereas a lot of the city's poor and working class residents got displaced for the games and ended up in outer-lying counties and didn't really get to reap the benefits from the Olympics that are often touted, like jobs and long-term economic stability and things like that. So yeah, I sort of try to explore that dynamic in all of my work, this kind of representative Black elite, but they don't actually represent the needs of the poor and working classes in the city.
Interesting. Well, I have to actually bring us back to Andre because I did misrepresent Mr. Brooks's comment. He was interested in your research on Trump voters. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more on that to kind of fill in that story.
Okay, so when we were, looking at Trump supporters, we were looking at how they were constructing themselves a white identity and how they, the different discourses they engaged in order to construct this like sort of narrative that they're aggrieved. And so essentially one of the main things that comes to mind is how they sort of like portrayed minority groups in order to construct this idea that these minority groups are, essentially taking resources, they're constructing minority groups as falsely aggrieved, essentially trying to discredit, different movements like Black Lives Matter, and essentially like develop this idea that these individuals are falsely aggrieved. And so that basically is like essentially like one of the main things that I was interested in with that is like looking at how we construct this idea of the racialized other, and that does go into play with like controlling images and how individuals are constructed in the minds of like these aggrieved white people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I don't want to keep stepping on. I'm excited. You guys are here, so I'm enthusiastic. Dr. Ghosh, feel free to push me aside with your questions, but let me just ask anyone who wants to share now. One of the issues I was thinking about was, these are all really contemporary questions that you're exploring. These are all kind of hot button issues for us. How do you feel? Has there been support in academia for you to pursue these kinds of academic questions, but also these intensely political questions? How do you feel about essentially the kind of setting for your research and the kind of a voice that you have? Whoever wants to take that.
I think I would say I feel like I've been supported a lot in terms of like my research interests. I would say that when like one of the reasons why is because I'm in the sociology department, we're very like conscious of how we're very social justice oriented already. So is already like sort of like motivated. For instance, like we have at FSU, we have a demography department, and we also a demography program, and also a health and aging, society health and aging program. And we also have an inequality program. Yet we say that essentially all three of these programs deal with inequality, because that's what a lot of sociologists sort of focus on, is inequality. However, I would say that despite this sort of culture where we're like pushing individuals to look at social injustice, there are certain barriers to how individuals expect you to look at these inequalities. I haven't experienced it, but I know some of my colleagues have been told that, essentially their ideas were not necessarily radical, but like essentially pushing them away from examining a more like critical perspective and sort of kind of like leaning more towards a less, less critical sort of like perspective in terms of like examining, certain structures. Yeah, but I haven't encountered that, but I know a lot of people who have told me that they, in their research, have been kind of like deterred from engaging with certain structures. Then there's also the factor of just like the individuals put in place to kind of help navigate critical examination of structural inequalities. For instance, like here at FSU, our sociology department is pretty big, but we only have two instructors of color. I'm sorry, specifically Black instructors who examine like these racial issues. Many of our instructors do look at inequality, but not as many look at like racial inequality. And that's something that I would think is like you're pushed to do, like you're definitely encouraged, but you're not necessarily gonna always have that support that you need to like really examine these inequalities.
So Kenny, since you're also the sociologist, is something that is familiar to you, or is there a difference in your experience at all?
Yeah, mine was similar. I think and a little different, did a little differently in the sense that, I mean, my project is so niche. So I think when I came in for a while, it was hard for me to find people to support that, but also again, how radical it was. But so I did have people that were like, you might be putting yourself in a box with this project, but I was so passionate about it, I didn't really care. Which worked out to my benefit. I ended up finding faculty that were able to support me in that sense. But it also made me have to do a lot of the work myself, which was great because I think it made me a lot more confident in this project, and I gained a lot of knowledge through it. And then as far as outside of this, working with the ballet community has been kind of fun and interesting. So throughout my interviews, I think for the most part, shockingly, I had a lot more support than I thought, but I do know like there's like the admin have been supportive, but like the actual like artistic directors have been kind of like hesitant about the project just because ballet has been so exclusive for so long. I think it, makes them nervous knowing these stories are out.
They don't want to unpack those stories.
Exactly. Yeah. So even there's some cases that like there was actually a discrimination case filed years ago, but you couldn't find it. You can't find it anywhere. It's only at the New York Public Library. And even when I went, they let me see it, but like I couldn't take a picture of it, couldn't go outside. So they try and keep these stories on hush for the most part. But I mean, I currently work for American Ballet Theater for their summer intensive. So like they've been kind of like, well, whatever you need. And I think because these conversations are happening now, they're trying to like find a way to like safely have them shared. So they've been asking me to do some talks there. But so it's like the administration is cool. The dancers, of course, just like the artistic directors. So like the choreographers and stuff are kind of anxious about it.
How was your experience while collecting the data? Like how your positionality, the fact that you are a ballet dancer yourself and your social identities impacted your data collection process?
Yeah, I had
in any way or created like challenges as well?
I actually created a lot of opportunities. I remember when I first started, I did like my first interviews, my pilot ones, and I didn't share that I was a dancer. So when I first went and I was talking, I remember it was one person in particular, and they were so vague with the story. They were just like, I don't want to get into that or this. And I wasn't really getting anything. She wasn't giving me anything. And then finally I was just really talking candidly. And I was like, yeah, I remember my experience and da-da. And I went on, she's like, oh, you were a dancer. And she went back and told me all of these stories. And then, so at that point, that was me learning how to, figure out this interview process. And I had to restructure and I had to say, like share my positionality. And once I did that, it definitely gave me more insight into these stories. a lot of times we're able to talk about people that we've all came across, like things like that. So yeah, it definitely helped. And then as far as the process of recruiting, because I have the insight, it made the process easy. I also work for an organization called Brown Girls Do Ballet. So through them, we were able to get a flyer to go out, and so many people were excited to actually got so many more participants than I thought I could have on my own. So
Interesting.
yeah.
We have some questions that are starting to show up, and I just want to encourage everybody, if you do have questions for any of our scholars, you can either wait and address them directly or put them in the chat, and we'll make sure they
So
get
there's a
out there.
Andre.
I do want to actually ask Maya about how you view efforts to diversify museum space.
Yeah,
I mean, you come from a public history background, right? And I would imagine that might be something very central to some of your interests.
sure. I'll just give a brief response to the last question as well,
Sure.
and say that history, I think, is also a bit of a mixed bag in terms of support. I don't think I really encountered issues with choosing my area of research. I think it's just dealing with factors in the field of history itself. So a big buzzword in history is presentism, like, and so when you're working on late 20th century work, some people will be like, well, this hasn't been long enough. This was 1996. There's not enough time that's passed by. And I'm like, well, I'm writing on it. So I think that's like a huge debate within the field, like how long is until something is history and you're allowed to write about it. And another thing has been voice itself. I think history has really struggled to appeal to people outside of history. And my advisor is here, Dr. Brooks. I'm in his seminar this semester, and our challenge is to really write in a more of a narrative style, because like historians realize that we're really losing all of our audience to other fields. And if like historians really want to have their voices heard going forward, we really need to make our narratives more inclusive and more understandable for people besides historians, which is another really big reason I got into public history and museum studies. I wanted people to learn history outside of the classroom. And in terms of museum studies and diversifying the field, that's an ongoing struggle. I think museums are doing better, but when you go to a museum, it's all about whether or not you're making your guests feel included. Like a big discussion we had was when you invite school children to museums and then you tell them to be quiet, that doesn't make them feel like they're in a safe space. It makes them feel like they're being controlled, and that doesn't make them want to return to museums going forward. But I think museums have the huge ability to foster participation in history, especially with young children of color. And I wanted to be in museum studies because I wanted to be that face that people saw, like they're seeing that Black people can be in this field. And so that's kind of how I got here. Yeah.
Great. So we have a question for Andre. So do you have any input on the Blacks for Trump or their ideas, or come across any African-American supporters in typically racially charged and opinionated environments such as Trump rallies?
Yeah, so essentially when we were doing that Trump paper, we were really hyper-focused on white Trump supporters, mainly because of the rhetoric that Trump engages in, speaks to like dog whistle politics, like going back to, like Lee Atwater and, the, Reagan campaign. So we really were looking at sort of these like dog whistles. And so, yeah, we really haven't even like, it would be interesting to examine, like Blacks for Trump. I do have a classmate who worked on, did something similar with women Trump supporters. And so something that she did was she examined like how women Trump supporters sort of kind of like reconcile with the sexist sort of like rhetoric surrounding the, Trump like discourse. And so I found that pretty interesting, assuming that if we were to engage in that type of research with African-American Trump supporters, it would be very similar in the sense of looking at how you know, a lot of these Blacks for Trump sort of kind of like interact with these sort of like racist narratives, especially the cultural racism within the Trump discourse.
Thank you.
So Sakani's graduating. And again, congratulations. That's a big milestone.
Thank you.
And something that is certainly to be recognized. And Andre and Maya, I know you've probably thought about a lot of the questions as you move forward. Where do you think your biggest impact will be? Do you plan to be a part of academia itself and continue on to do the job search to teach, or are you looking outside of the academy and thinking about ways that your research can impact, you know, our culture in different ways? What's next?
Yeah, I am currently on the job market, so I do have some offers. So essentially, I am going the route of being a professor. Yes, I'm very excited. So, but one thing that's always been important to me was public sociology. So again, that's why I started working with American Ballet Theater and Brown Girls Do Ballet. I wanted to find ways to kind of, you know, use my research, but also actually make an impact. And so that's kind of what I've been doing outside, because I mean, as I went through the process, I wasn't sold on being a professor for a very long time. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. So I was like, I mean, I know how to do the school thing, so let's keep going. And then I was throughout the process, I'm like, I don't know if I want to be a professor. I still wasn't sold on it. And then I started seeing a variety of ways of teaching. And then again, how our research can be more impactful outside. And once I was exposed to that in public sociology, that's kind of what led me to be like, no, I want to be able to teach, but also be able to help, you know, outside. And so I still plan on working with them. I am like the research person for Brown Girls Do Ballet. So it's fun being able to do my research and also kind of let it be shown outside of just academia, which was always my goal. And then with American Ballet Theater, yes, I'm working and trying to get more, find ways how we can incorporate and really make change within the space and really talk about diversity and figure out how we can really like actually make change. I mean, I think these conversations happen all the time, but then they fade away, which has happened through ballet for so long. So now, since we really have this position, I'm trying to figure out and implement like actual roles and jobs within ballet. And outside of it, of course, like I said, I mean, I think it's really cool, Maya, that you're talking about museums. That's one thing I've always been thinking about with art and how we can kind of implement change within those spaces and make them more inclusive spaces.
So what recommendations are you making based on your research findings? I'm quite interested in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the funny thing is, as we've been watching like protests and things happen, figuring out who's being required to speak on these things. And for so long, you know, it's like these Black ballet dancers have had talk. And at one point I kind of realized like, this is not their job. Like we shouldn't make them be the ones speaking about these issues. I mean, so I've been kind of gearing towards directing a lot of this work towards like the board members and the artistic directors, because I mean, the cause is coming a lot from these choreographers and directors, and the way they're happening, that's what these stories, I'm trying to use these stories to say these minor things. So you might not think, oh, I'm not explicitly discriminating against her, but I'm telling you these little things that are happening. And we need to also talk to the board members, which again kind of goes over to other things like art and things like that, because they're the patrons, because they're funding these spaces. So a lot of times they get to make the final choice. And so I realized we're talking about ballet dancers who don't have that much agency, but these people have all of the agency. So I've been also wanting to kind of get into those spaces and to like find ways where we can also, you know, try and diversify those spaces, because it's nice that we won't really see change until then. And what happens with these ballet dancers is they reach this racial fatigue at some point, and that's why they leave. So it's like, they're not the ones we need to, like, that's gonna happen. But until we like deal with, you know, the people that are actually in charge and have all this agency and power,
Mhm.
it's not going to be effective for these dancers or a safe space for them.
So did you get a chance to talk to the directors and the choreographers and
Yeah.
as well?
I talked to a few, not everyone wanted to talk to me, which is fair, but I have been able to talk to a few. And what's been cool, at least about like me working for American Ballet Theater, is they're more receptive right now. So they'll at least listen, whether they actually want to do actual interviews, not always, but they have definitely been involved in, like, whenever I do these like talks, they've been really receptive in that sense.
Right. So there's a question for Maya and Sekini. So this is from James Brooks, and James is asking, I'm curious about possible connections between Maya's work on Black urban social political elites and Sekini's on Black dancers in the ballet world. Are there crossover linkages in these projects? That's a great question.
I think there are. When I was listening to you talk, I was like, yeah, that sounds like kind of what I explore a little bit. Yeah, so I think there are.
Yeah, I do too. I think talking about like the Black middle class is interesting because, I mean, it is very different than the working class experience, and sometimes that doesn't always correlate. Just because everyone's Black doesn't mean everyone's viewpoints are the same, which can probably touch on when we talk about like Black Americans and who supports Trump. So I think it goes across board, definitely.
Interesting. So do we want to talk about your graduate school experience, or do we still want to talk about your research? I mean, students can
Well,
keep
I
on
do want to make sure that, like, all of our wonderful panelists, I want you to tell our students both the best and the hardest thing about graduate school. We have to do that. But we still have some time, and I definitely want to keep it flowing. But I'm looking forward to seeing that personal advice. What would you tell your younger self now, maybe?
like what factors like shaped your choice, like to go to graduate school? Like how would you advise students in getting graduate opportunities, like starting from like, you know, preparing for GRE, like the programs you decided to choose or apply for? So those kind of things, or initial thoughts about program where you fit, and faculty mentoring and funding opportunities, or any kind of challenges that came to your mind while you were applying to grad school. So if you could just, you know, touch upon these things a bit, it will be helpful for the students.
Do you want to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
I would always advise people not to go to graduate school the way I did, because I would say that I definitely went to my master's program, not on a whim, but I applied like a month before the deadline. I didn't really have time to consider factors. So I would say be prepared in advance, like well out. Don't make these life-changing decisions a month before deadlines, especially like when it comes to like the GRE and all of that. I again started studying for that like a month before my test date. So I just would say that you need to give yourself more time, like give yourself at least a year of preparation, whether that's reaching out to contact programs, whether that's studying for the GRE. And really don't go to any graduate program if you don't truly feel welcomed by them. If a program really wants you, they'll let you know in every way possible. Whether that's, as of the last 3 years, via Zoom conversations. When I was deciding to come to UGA, they actually had one of their graduate students running around campus giving us a virtual tour, which is kind of hilarious. If a program really wants you, they'll let you know, and they will give you funding. If they are not giving you funding, I do not recommend going. You do not need to go into substantial debt over continued higher education. So make sure they make you feel welcome and make sure they give you money.
I hope everyone out there saw all of these nodding heads on those points. Those are critical points. So, Andre, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I definitely agree with Maya, because something that I experienced when I was applying for grad school is I really didn't I didn't know that there are differences in like LinkedIn programs and like, oh, what's the difference between like a terminal master's and so like I ended up attending Valdosta State, which I'm grateful for the time that I spent there, but I spent 2 years there. And essentially, when I got to FSU, it was like, because of the credits, it was like, you know, I had to essentially redo my first like two semesters of grad school. And it's like, why am I retaking these classes? And even though it was beneficial for me in the long run, and like the courses at FSU were a little bit more rigorous, so it was like the statistical training that I received was a little bit better. It was just a little bit like annoying to me that I had to retake these classes, but of course I didn't do that research beforehand, so I can't really blame anyone but myself. Yeah.
Let's see, I have a few. I think as of right now, what I would say, I'm not sure if there is McNair on your campus, but if you can join it, please join it. If you are able to join it, McNair, like, I don't even know if I would have applied to grad school if I wasn't in McNair. And the selling point for me, I did not want to do it. My advisor was like, I think you need to do McNair. She wasn't very asked. It was like, you're gonna do McNair. And I was like, what is this? No. And then honestly, what sold me was that I got a stipend. So I did it. And honestly, it was the best choice. It really taught, for someone like me that, again, my parents, I'm first gen. So they really explained step by step things to do. They fully, again, they supported you financially when you were applying to grad school, which I'm not sure how many of you are aware, they paid for all of our applications. So I was able to apply to as many as I want. Now, this goes back to Maya's thing, do it early. I did everything so last minute. So I probably didn't apply to as many as I needed to, but I didn't need to. Luckily, I was able to get into the program that I wanted to. So that's what I would say while you're like what you can do right now. If you don't get into McNair though, I still encourage you to start looking into research projects. I mean, the faculty are there, they're excited. So even if you have your own, you can either work on a project with them, or if you have an idea, just find someone that's best fit for that and that can support you do that. I think that's a good way of getting your feet like in the door. And then again, you don't have to go in and be a professor if that's not what you want to do. Like, you can also do this research and then use it for other avenues, which, like I said, that's something I was interested in, I would encourage. And then let's see, the process of just going to grad school again, yes, do it early. Think about little things. I was big on location. I'm born and raised in California. I thought I was very picky about where I wanted to go. New York was really my only option. I wanted to be in a big city. And I know some people are like, that limits you, but I was happy. That was something that was important to me so I can be happy in this process. So the location matters, so you can be happy. You want to be happy in the space. You don't want to be there miserable. Grad school is a lot of work. So the last thing you want to do is be miserable in the state or wherever you're at and like going through grad school. Also, again, make sure you have time to be a person. That's important. I think some people forget that. So be a person. And I think the last thing I would say about that, I mean, I think I have kind of a lot of things since I've been in here for so long, but the last thing I would take is do something that you love to do. Do a project you love. Like I said, when I went in, I wanted to study ballet dancers because it was important to me. And I know I did have people like, again, they were like, you might be putting yourself in a box, and I didn't care. And looking back on it, I'm still excited about this project. It's something I love doing on my free time. So I think that's a big thing. And then I was able to find faculty members that supported me and were able to make me very competitive in this process, which again, I have offers waiting now for positions. So I mean, it ended up working out. I got in now and I still love this project. I meet people all the time that are like, I'm so sick of my project. I don't want to do this project anymore. Or they feel like they just got pushed into a project. Don't do that to yourself. Find something that you love, and there's a way. You have faculty there that can help you position it in a way that's more rigorous or competitive.
Yeah. Maya notes in the comments to be an advocate for your own work, and that is so important. I just think that is critical, and I think that really ties in with what how our discussion has gone, that you know best what is original and creative and what you can bring to the field. And yeah, you have to get that voice out there, not listen to the naysayers, right?
And it's very
There's a
important.
scholarly way to do that, but I just think it's really important, as Maya notes, to speak up and advocate.
And it's very important to connect with the project you're doing. So personal connection is very important. So would you like to talk more about like taking seminars in grad school and, you know, working as an RA or a TA, like research assistant or teaching assistant? So plans for the masters and like taking subcoms and, you know, doccoms exams and developing a dissertation, like the entire process of going through grad school, if you just could shed light on that a bit.
Yeah, so the project I went into, which also is another thing, I mean, I looked into PhD, like MA and PhD programs, so it's straight through, which the good thing about majority of those, they are fully funded. And then, I mean, the thing is, you know, I always tell people, even if you just want a master's, go that route because you can leave and then you leave without any loans or anything like that. You can master out is what they'll call it. But when I went in, luckily we had our first year, my first 2 years, I was on a stipend, so I didn't have to TA or anything, so I can focus on my seminars. I don't know, for me, it was a completely different world. I've been doing school for so long, which is another thing. These little things come, but like, don't be afraid to take a break if you feel like you need to. I realized a lot of people in my cohort took time to do other things. I went straight from undergrad, and then from high school, I went straight to undergrad. So I never took a break. And I think, I don't know if I always advise that, but to each his own, I would say. But I had those first 2 years. So that allowed me to really focus on the courses, which again, it was a completely different experience for me. It was a lot more rigorous than I intended. So that actually was really great for me to just be able to focus on it. But seminars it was just a different experience. I mean, we were required to just like, the reading was so substantial from what I was used to in undergrad. So getting used to that. Again, I went in at 22. So my mind was still on like trying to have a life and party all the time. So trying to figure that balance out was really hard for me because the amount of reading I couldn't really get in the discussions. I mean, there are long discussions, at least at my school. So it's like, you couldn't really get away with not doing the reading. And so that was something I learned the hard way. So trying to navigate those two was hard. And then after my second year, I started being a teaching assistant. I love it. I mean, again, you have to learn the depending on the course, let me actually say that. But because I feel like I was able to learn things, I took it as another course to be able to learn new things. Again, you work on your time management because you are grading, so things like that. But I also used it as prep, as things I liked and I would use to teach, ways I didn't like the course was structured. I took note in that. So I was able to use that to figure out what my pedagogy would be, the way I wanted to teach assignments that I felt were effective or not, because I'm big on, I don't like my time wasted, so I try not to waste other people's time. So ways that they were beneficial and help students later, and they would remember the project. So those were my experiences throughout that time. So I think the biggest thing, grad school is just a weird place, and it's kind of sometimes hard to explain, but I think I would say trying to figure out the balance between, you know, trying to be a human, trying to take courses, being a teaching assistant, all that, and doing your own research.
Andre and Maya, are you teaching yet? I think Andre, you are teaching, correct? I don't know if Maya, if you're doing that.
I'm not teaching quite yet. Well, not at FSU. I've taught at VSU, but essentially, I like what Sakani said about like not having like that first year, not having the TA, even though I didn't have that experience. It would have been nice to have that. But also, I think the way that I had experienced it was also kind of nice, because I came in my first semester as a research assistant, and that sort of kind of helped me kind of understand the culture in terms of like a research university and like what is expected. And then also, I also like the fact that I had both research experience as a research assistant and experience as a teaching assistant, because I think that, you know, you get to see two sides of the coin. If you're not interested in teaching, or if you're not interested in research, it probably wouldn't be useful. But if you are interested in both, it would be useful to kind of get both of those experiences.
Maya, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was just gonna add, like, you know, like they were saying, like whether you're a research assistant or a teaching assistant will depend on like the program you choose. But for my master's degree, I was a research assistant for my entire 2 years there. And that was a really valuable experience for me. I really love doing that because I really like to say that like research isn't something like you're born knowing how to do. It's very much something that you learn how to do and you get better at over time. So taking the opportunity to be a research assistant, even if it's just for a semester, will really help you with your own research and just how to do it in general. And right now I'm a teaching assistant, and with UGA, the first year students are graders. And I think that's been really good for me because I've really never had any experience grading before this first year, or like I went to Agnes Scott, which is a very small school. So I'd never even been in a huge like room with 300 people. That was something I'd only like seen on TV. So just really getting that experience grading and being in like large scale history seminars and adding that as a, you know, skill on my resume is good. And going back to kind of taking breaks between programs, I definitely recommend doing that. So I took a year between undergrad and my master's degree. And then I took 8 months between my master's degree and my PhD. And those times were particularly valuable. I know between undergrad and my master's, I was like, I'm gonna read 100 books that have nothing to do with history. I'm gonna love it and really enjoy it. And I did. And same thing with the time in between my master's and PhD program. I really was like, I'm gonna read the furthest thing from history and have a lot of fun in between. So yeah, I definitely recommend taking a break. That's completely okay. Like, and that year to really kind of build up your graduate application and do the research and study and all of that is valuable. But if you go straight through, that's also a good option as well.
Right. Now we definitely want to take any questions from the audience. Got a lot of people out there, and I don't know if Dr. Grissett has any advice on managing some direct questions from students in the audience, or if you want to just continue posting in the chat and allowing us to then read the question out. But if you are interested.
Yeah, either way, if anyone wants to unmute their mic or their video and ask a question, that would be fine. Or feel free, if you're not comfortable doing that, you can just type it in the chat, be fine.
Okay, so I have a question.
Speak up, Marty.
So, right now, I'm really not like enjoying undergrad because it's like so much reading and writing. So like, what would be some tips that you would have going into master's school, since it's like that plus other stuff? Because I'm not really like good at reading and writing and taking tests. That's not really what I.
So advice when you're kind of feeling just a little, maybe blocked a little bit, a little kind of, yeah, overloaded. How do you get through that?
I think, I mean, I don't know how helpful it is, but I think what was good for me is sometimes, at least I know for undergrad, when I had like theory courses and stuff, I was not a fan. And I was just like, I would never, I was like, I would never be a theory person. It wasn't until I got to grad school, and honestly, not even in courses outside of it, I started relating it to things I cared about. So I found ways to, like, again, even through my research, connect things. Like once I started doing the project, and again, that's why I think I did stuff that I loved. I always picked up things I liked. And then when theory was then presented that way, it was made it easier to read. And now I understand the theories that I learned in undergrad and stuff like that, because I learned it in a different way. Like one book that really got me excited. I read a book about like modeling. That was something different, you know, it wasn't like a regular like academic book, I would say, but it was. It had a lot of theory in it. It was a research thing. So that I started finding stuff like that that fit my actual interest. So then there's a book out now. It's called like, sorry, I'm looking like I can see the bookcase right here, but it's called like Very Important Person by Ashley Mears. And it's about like club culture. So like in New York, so kind of how like bottle service works and things like that. So that was something like, I'm like, okay, I can relate to that and that's interesting. But then through it, so it ended up being a good book to read for me just because I was interested in it, but I was able to then learn the things I needed to, and it got me back excited. I realized through courses, I was so drained because I was reading things that I wasn't particularly interested in, which that's just gonna happen. But I was just trying to find ways. I then found other books outside that I just like the topics that, so now I always pick up books that are really like research books that are topics I care about and I'm interested in.
Thank you.
And I think also, yeah, I feel like something that you would also have to think about if you're not particularly like oriented towards like reading and writing and having to do that rigorous like academic work, there are differences between master's programs that, you know, are more practical and more oriented towards like, you know, you go in and you're trying to like do something particular in like a, you know, a particular career or field versus programs that are more geared towards like training you for, you know, academia or training you, you know, in this like PhD sense. So I went to VSU, which was more of a, I believe, I forgot the particular like name of the degree, but it was like a more oriented towards a practical education in sociology, leaning towards students who were more likely to go into like school counseling or actual, you know, something that wasn't academic related or research related, you know, if that makes sense.
And Dr. Kimona, it sounds like applied sociology.
Essentially, yeah, that's what it was. It was an applied sociology program. That's what it was.
Great.
Clemson University has that. Clemson University in South Carolina has that program. Yeah.
Great.
I don't really care about theories and like all that fancy stuff with all these old people who are dead now. That like I just never found myself to like care about that. I'd rather do something that I feel like would more match my passion.
Yeah. I didn't either. So I would definitely just say, look outside, things that you like, and then, you know, it connects, but I made sure I situated the stuff. There's still like, you can find other scholars. So like I said, once I started doing this, I started finding more like Black feminist theorists that like I related to more. I just really tried to find things that I related to. So then even outside of it, I started doing things like, even like my research topics, I always found things again that I liked. I'm really into like looking at these like, kind of like these like Pilates classes and things like that. And then I just find, you know, ways of connecting it that way. It doesn't always have to go through, there's staple theorists that they'll say, but there's so many more. And that's what it would be, you know, I always like to encourage us to look beyond like the same ones that people talk about. And it's okay to do that.
I'm going to embarrass Marty here just a little bit and say that Marty is a great writer. So one of the things that I would just say, and not to insert myself too much here, but just to know that sometimes if I'm kind of just not feeling it, I have to remember that I want to say something, that something is actually really interesting to me and I want to say something. And that means I have to sit at my computer for another hour or two, but I have something to say. And if I value my voice, then that kind of drives me into the material a little bit. So that's my 2 cents. Let's let our commentators speak more here.
You know, it's something like Marty said earlier that he wasn't a good reader or good at reading and writing. I think you said that you weren't good at writing. And I feel like that kind of like pushes on something that I thought about a lot with my experiences in my first year, which is imposter syndrome, and like feeling like you're not good enough, or feeling like, I'm not good at this, so I don't need to, focus my energy on it, and I feel like, yeah, you should be aware of like that your first year, especially like feeling like you don't belong in that space when in actuality, yeah, you're probably better than you think you are. You'll probably way more than you think you actually would in that space.
Well, thank y'all for the encouraging word and the tip.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Maya, when you're kind of hitting a wall, what do you do to find that excitement again?
I think this is where your classmates are really valuable to you in your graduate programs. So if there's concepts that you just aren't really understanding, somebody else probably understands it better than you. And so like really working together and thinking out like these very theory heavy pieces at time. And that's where the seminars and the graduate colloquiums are really useful. Those aren't like intimidating discussions. Everyone's just saying what they got out of the readings, and that might clarify some things. And just like a little secret, historians do not read every line of these books. A skill that you really pick up in graduate school is how to read for those really big ideas and the thesis without reading every paragraph or footnote that are in the book. So that's a skill that'll be definitely developed throughout your time in graduate school. And it's just about, finding the right graduate program. That is kind of why I picked public history. So I could get to do more project-based things rather than just, reading and writing. So one thing we got to do was we had to work with a museum on a project as part of our master's thesis and come up with an event or a thing like that. So I got to help with the Olympics exhibit at the Atlanta History Center, which I wrote my thesis on it. So I think that was pretty cool to be included on that project with them. So just making sure you find the right program for you.
Nice. Any other questions, any other comments out there? I know we've got a pretty good sized audience. I bet there's some good issues to raise here from the student side of things, not just from the professor side. I could talk to you guys all night long, but
I do like what Maya said about leaning on your classmates a little bit. Like, not, you don't necessarily have to lean on them too much, but when it comes to emotional support, not just like inside the classroom, but just like in general, they could be very useful and also very helpful in sort of kind of like navigating things. Because if you don't understand it, chances are someone else doesn't understand it, or that has really been a big help, especially coming in with the same cohort. And it's like a huge difference for me at FSU compared to VSU, where at VSU sort of had this like disjointed cohort because everyone were at different levels, versus like when I came to FSU, everyone was on the same level, everyone was being fully funded, and everyone was sort of like this, like we're like a tight-knit family. So I feel like that type of culture, if you could find that type of culture, that would be very useful.
well, let me actually ask a kind of final question just to kind of bring us together a little bit here. If you could wave a magic wand, have some kind of power to diversify, change, reform academia, to open it up, to make it represent the kind of world that you would want to be in, and you want everyone to have a voice in, what would you do? What would you do to essentially, open up the pipeline of graduate school and academia to really make it a more welcoming and diverse place?
Well, I think the first thing I would try to do is kind of try to bridge that knowledge gap, kind of train them young. I think the problem is that like for like students of color, they only know about these fields later on in life. Like I didn't discover public history till I was a senior in undergrad, and I didn't think about museums as a career until midway through undergrad. Whereas I feel like other students are encouraged way earlier in life to go into their field. So like really just like training people from the start in like elementary school about the many careers and ways that they could live their life. It's not just, you know, doctor, lawyer, whatever. Like history is a valid field for kids to choose. So making kids feel like from early on that it's a cool career is a goal of mine personally, and a way to diversify the field from the start.
Great. We do have actually a late question here. So before we get, I'm going to come back to Andre and to Connie about the big kind of concluding question, but Talik Hill would like to know, do you have any suggestions on how to go about conducting research with a foreign topic that you don't have direct experience or access to information about for beginners? I remember that question from some early discussions in graduate school. How do you do this kind of research? So any thoughts that you might have on how to kind of, you know, overcome some geographical or experience challenges in research?
At least I would say with history, I would start off by looking at like the big names in that area of research and see what they've published and read their works. So we call it historiography, just going back and to see what people have written about that topic. So that should give you a beginning basis for like what people have written and where your research might fit into that equation. So yeah, starting off by searching for people who've discussed that area you're interested in. And you might discover that no one's talked about that topic, and that it's time for you to talk about that topic and be the first, which is a scary but amazing feeling.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say start off seeing what's out there already, what conversations, and then as far as actually getting access, see what spaces are local. Um, and reach out to like, even if it's just a small organization that's doing something that you're interested in, reach out to them and see if you can attend whatever meetings or things like that, and go from there. I also think it's important to be transparent. So if you're in a space that, you know, thinking about your positionality within the space, be transparent about that. Like, don't go in trying to automatically take over or control or give your opinion. See what they're talking about first, see what their needs are, and then go from there and see how you can add, you know, like, and be of use there. I think that's like the things I would say.
Okay. So other thoughts on how we diversify academia and make it a more welcoming space for all?
I agree with Maya when she was talking about in general learning about things early. That was my experience, and that's what I always try to encourage students now. Like I think the question I love asking students is, what do you like to look at, like on social media? What do you spend most of your time? That's your interest. Then we can find a field from there. I think we're a lot of times we're just not taught those things, or we're encouraged to when we're directed out. I remember in high school, originally I was kind of thinking, throwing the idea as I wanted to be an art buyer. People are like, that's not really something that, you know, like you can maintain throughout the years. Like I wasn't encouraged or directed something similar. I mean, I love what I do now, but I think having the options, I think even with colleges, I wasn't told like, okay, you can go outside of like my little bubble. Things like that. I wasn't always encouraged. So I try and encourage students to do that now. I think how else we can diversify is on a more structural level, like the curriculum. I think it took me forever to start taking, even in high, you know, when you're younger and you're taking like, it's like Black History Month and you're learning just about slavery. Like it took me forever to start learning about people other than Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So I think trying to have those conversations early and trying to like, trying to really challenge or ask for a diversified curriculum. Like, I mean, even when I took theory courses, the only person I learned about was Du Bois. So outside of that, I had to learn more about Black sociologists and theorists and things like that. But I would encourage that we actually question, or ask the department, like, can we have a diversified curriculum when we take these courses and learn these things?
Oh yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I could say, like, my first real history class, honestly, was at GSW with Dr. Bragg. Just like, that was the first one. And it was like, where, we weren't just talking about the big hitters, and like, we weren't just talking about slavery in the civil rights movement. We're actually talking about like, like real people, and like, we were talking about like this like overall narrative, not just the people, like, not just like big names.
And I didn't even pay him to say that. Wasn't that nice? I remember Andre as a student. And of course, one of the things that your story to me represents, and feel free to give perspective from your side of things, but it represents that kind of curiosity that's often out there, and we have to kind of encourage it and allow it to bloom and to foster, all these new kinds of interesting research projects. And a lot of times, particularly in education, where it's kind of a traditional thing like a US history survey, we're so busy kind of lecturing, right? There's a narrative we're kind of running through. So yeah, anytime that we can kind of slow things down and kind of find those points of creativity and curiosity, that's super exciting to me. And I think I always saw that in you as somebody who was, I think you always kind of sat a little bit in the back, not in the way back, but you weren't going to be the person who was like waving your hand up front, right? But you were the person where I could see, lots of good
I like to
questions.
speak to that too, because I feel like people, like, when we like sort of like identify, like, everyone has the interest, everyone has, the potential to do, what we do. But like, what it really takes is like individuals to kind of like identify these, these students, and kind of like, like gauge their mind and see what they're interested in, and actually move that forward. And it goes, back to like having this introduced, earlier than, college, but just like in high school, or, even as early as elementary school. It's just like, having this sort of like dedication, and kind of like identifying what students want to do, and sort of kind of like, showing them the different sort of like opportunities that they can have in terms of like, accomplishing that.
Yeah. I also think it's important to just go talk to your professors. I know that sounds crazy, but like, even if it's in class and it's a little thing, it could be the littlest thing that was brought up, and you can go to them and just be like, hey, I like that part. Like, I like learning about this part. I want to talk more about it. I mean, I think that was kind of my intro into doing research. I actually probably never really talked to my faculty, to the professors, but I remember when I took a course with my mentor now, there was one little thing she had talked about, and I was like, I like this. Like, I literally just went to her office, and I was just like, hey, I like that you talked about this today. And we started talking more. And honestly, we just started talking about like things outside of just, like, it wasn't like this theory, like this intense theory conversation, which it can be, but it wasn't. We were just talking about life. And that's why she introduced like, oh, let's do McNair. And that's when I was at the point where like, well, what would I study? Because I don't want to do anything boring. That's like I'm always like, I don't want to be bored. So I was like, what? But we had conversations about cheerleading at the time. And so because her daughters were cheer. So that was also, we're just in there, and I saw a picture of her kids like cheer. And I was like, oh, I used to cheer. And that's how the conversation went. And so it was like, oh, do you want to coach my cheer? And then we were just like, oh, like, let's do this McNair thing. So it really worked organically, and it literally shaped my whole trajectory at that point. So I know sometimes it's like, well, what am I going to go talk to them about? And, sometimes it could be intimidating or awkward, but the littlest thing, and who knows how the conversation would go.
Actually, what is kind of interesting is I remember when I was a freshman, one of the assignments we had to do for our like first year experience class is we had to actually go to our professors and like ask questions and ask them about their, research interests. And, so I feel like that's a pretty cool thing, because like when I was at VSU, I remember I was working with this program that the first year programs, and we were like developing these like curriculums for like the first year seminar class. And something that I was like adamant about implementing, because I experienced it at GSW, was implementing this like sort of like get to know your professor sort of thing. And I feel like that would be very useful to have for students. It's like really having these conversations with their professors their freshman year, and not just like when they're juniors and seniors, when people are, actually interested in like mentoring them.
Yeah. Dr. Grissett notes that we do have there is the Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participants LSAMP program for STEM field students. So if you're interested, look in the comments. I think, yeah, there's a link that Dr. Grissett has provided as well for those who are interested. I will just note that the pandemic has really reshaped office culture for my department, but there is nothing I like better when students come by and we just kind of talk about what's interesting, right? So I hope, that we find a way to do that in a healthy and sane way, and get back to those conversations more. Any other questions out there? Any other comments? Anyone out there thinking about graduate school? Have we encouraged you or scared you? There's one new message. Let me get down here. Oh, good.
Yeah, I'm
Ashley,
going to graduate school.
good for you. And Ashley, and that's a good point, going back to something that Maya had noted, taking a little tiny break, not a bad thing. Rejuvenate, refresh, rethink what your purpose is. And yeah,
It's
then when you're
really
ready
not
to bring
a,
that creativity, right?
it's really not a bad idea to take a break. My cohort, I think it was me and one other girl. We came in at 22, and the closest person to us was like 26, 27. And everyone was older from there. So, I mean, it's not a bad idea.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate, oh, there's another one. I'm not, at least not right away. This is Carrie. Maybe at a later date if my job would help pay for it, but I can't go into any more debt anytime soon. And I think that's a really powerful point from the undergraduate perspective. But I would just note, and maybe our commentators would like to speak more about this before we close up, that graduate school is a whole different beast than undergraduate on that regard. There can be programs that are very exploitative, and as our speakers very rightfully noted, those are the programs you don't go to, right? And I'm not saying that, Carrie, you just jump in without thinking about those financial issues, but I don't know if anyone else has any comments on the financial side of things before we wrap it up more formally. I will just say I don't have any debt from my graduate school experience whatsoever, and I think most of my colleagues were similar, and I don't know.
Yeah,
You guys?
I didn't. I say when you're applying to grad school, at least like I can speak on these MA PhD programs, be very vocal about that. I mean, when I was in undergrad, I was working 2 jobs. So I was like, I need to make sure I'm secure if I'm going to do this program where you expect a lot of my time. And so I made sure I got funding, full funding the whole time I was there. My whole time I've been here, I've been funded for. And then also you can also negotiate summer funding. I did my first 2 years, and then I've been I actually taught my own classes the last one. So there's ways to do it. I'm walking out with no debt. I didn't come out of pocket at all. And I've been able to live. And again, I live in Los Angeles, which is not cheap. So there are ways for them to fund me to live in Los Angeles.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think those like those research positions and those teaching positions often like pay for your, graduate education. And yeah, again, don't go to any program if they're not really willing to fund you at the graduate level. Another thing that I will say that I was kind of surprised by once I got to grad school were university fees. Those are kind of like the only thing that I had to deal with where my tuition was paid, but I had to pay all these extra fees, and those sort of surprised me. So I would say keep an eye on university fees that no one talks about, like the buses or the
Yeah.
gym that they make you pay for out of pocket. And you're suddenly surprised, as well as health insurance. So those are things to keep in mind. But for the most part, in terms of like tuition and all of that, I don't have any debt for my master's program or my PhD program. Just those fees.
Yeah, so those are sometimes hidden. So when I was in grad school, I was paying around like $1,500 to $1,600 for a 9 credit hours, per semester. So that will be around like how much, doing the math, 3,000, 3,200. And with summer, at least you have to take 3 credit hours. I think that's in most universities if you're funded as a TA or an RA. So you pay around like $400. So so it's throughout the year, it will just, sum up to around like 3,600 to 4,000, depending how many credit hours you're taking throughout the year. So those are hidden costs, even if your tuition is waived off, but still you have to pay those fees that Maya just spoke about. Because that was my situation. And it also depends on which state you're going to for your grad school. Not every state. I had friends in Kansas and Ohio. They didn't have to pay as much as I had to pay because I went to Illinois. So it was pretty expensive there. So you have to keep that in mind, which state you're going for your grad school.
I mean, and also remember there are like, fellowships that you can apply for in order to fund graduate school too, or to help funding.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of costs that can be incurred. I mean, like a lot of times people will sign up for programs to prepare for the GRE or, just applying can be expensive. And so I don't want to be too, dismissive of those economic issues. One of the things that I do think that is important is if you are coming in, you're prepared and you're doing your research, as our panelists have noted, you're able to mitigate or manage, some of those issues to come out where, your time is spent really focusing on your work and building your career rather than working those extra jobs just to kind of get by. So yes, we should all do our research, and there are many exploitative parts of graduate school that can exist out there. But if you're working hard and you're focused and you are somebody who is speaking up for your ideas, hopefully you're able to access some financial support as well as, mentorship and other kinds of support.
Yeah, I think it's important, really be honest. That was my experience throughout the whole process. So even in undergrad, when it came to, again, luckily McNair was already planned to pay for those, but I was strategic about those things. Like I made sure while I was in McNair, like, okay, these are going to get taken care of. What about this? I mean, again, I did some things last minute. So sometimes there were forms I had to fill out to get it waived, but in those, I'm like, listen, I want to apply. I do not have it. And they were able to, the people were very receptive when I was very honest about those things. Even till this day, as I'm on this job market right now, most of them I've been able to do on Zoom, but some of them I had to fly out, and I'm like, I can't afford to go out. So what resources can we use? And they're just like, okay, thanks. I'm like, I can't get reimbursed. I need it upfront. So they're finding ways. So anytime I'm like, the schools have resources, just use it, ask, figure out the people. It took me a long time to really do that, but we're paying, these schools make so much money, find ways to get supported in some department. I also was in EOP, which was another support system that I used in undergrad.
I also just wanted to add that on kind of the opposite note, once you're in a graduate program, a lot of them have additional funds that they'll use for your professional development. So those are funds you should definitely apply for. That's really so you could go to conferences, or you can do research. And so I've gone to several conferences with graduate funding, and it's an additional application, but hey, money is money. And so use that money to go to new places and meet new people. And so I know I went to the National Council of Public History conference in Connecticut. I'd never been to New England before. It was a whole experience for me as a Southerner who doesn't like cold. So it definitely take advantage of that once you get there.
Yeah, I agree. I think not even just looking at what support the program is going to provide you, but like what support the university itself will provide you, because I think I really, lucked out with FSU because of the different like organizations on campus for graduate students. We have our Congress of Graduate Students, and we have AKD for sociology honor students, and like they have so much like funding and support for graduate students in terms of conferences and professional development workshops. And so like even if you get to your grad program and there's this like method, this research method that you can't really like learn in the program, or you want to know more about, you can take advantage of those funds and go to these workshops on these on those methods or whatever.
And Dr. Brooks notes that this is good experience because, quote, when you're a faculty member, you'll be writing grant applications all the time, in caps. So yes, learning to speak up and advocate for yourself is a lifelong process in academia. And I really am impressed by all three of you. And I really appreciate your time that you spent speaking with us, for sure. I hope that all of our students have been taking some good notes here about ideas that they want to continue to explore. Speaking up, speaking with others, just being information sponges. I mean, that's the most important thing, I think, at this stage for students. So I guess we will draw it to a close, but again, I want everyone to kind of give our speakers a big round of applause in your own homes or wherever you are, and join with me in thanking Sakani and Andre and Maya for joining with us. I hope we'll all meet someday in person, but hey, Zoom is working pretty good here, and I really appreciate that this has been such an instructive time. And Dr. Grissett also notes great questions, great comments, and we really appreciate hearing from all of you. And Andres put his email in there, so if anyone wants to contact him, presumably he's offering that up. Thank you, Andre. I certainly look forward to catching up with you more at some point soon, but it's nice to see a familiar face and to meet some new scholars here as well. So thank you all. I don't know if Dr. Ghosh has anything final to say, but I just want to say thanks to everyone.
Same here. Thank you, everybody. And secondly, you saved us.
Oh, no worries. I'm happy to be here.
I'm glad that I came across your piece. It was very well written and very well captured the intersectional experiences of Black women ballet dancers. So thank you for doing such great work. And I really look forward to talking to you in the future, of course, and definitely to Andre, like a sociologist, and Maya as well, to get some historical perspective on stuff. So thank you very much for joining us and for a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Feel free to reach out if you have questions or comments.
Sure.
So I wish you all good night, and good night to all our audience people, and I'll see you back. And I look forward to hearing some comments tomorrow in my classes maybe too, so we can continue that conversation.
Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.
Good night.